Okay. Thanks so much, everyone, for being here. This is Data Privacy Part 1 with Antoinette King, who's been conducting our cybersecurity sessions. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Just a friendly reminder, I will be providing a follow-up email complete with an online evaluation, as well as the method in which a CE certificate can be requested. And this recording will be posted to Niche Academy as well as YouTube. So with that, it is 2 o'clock. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Antoinette.
Hello, everybody. Happy halfway to the holiday season. I feel like I blinked my eyes and next thing you know, it's almost Christmas. So today we are going to specifically talking about data privacy, and it kind of dovetails very well in with cybersecurity. As I do every session, I'd love for some active participation. This is a super small group today, so hopefully we'll have a few more people jump on. But if you have questions, by all means, just unmute yourself and jump in. Normally I say stay muted, but there's only a handful of us, so I don't mind if someone has a question and they want to jump in or add anything to the content. So if you I think everybody's been on a session with me, so I'll give a super brief overview. My name is Antoinette King. I live in Bloomingburg. I am on the board of trustees for Mamakating Library. And so I have 2 kids. One is in Pine Bush School District. The other one goes to Fordham. I recently went back to school and got my master's degree, which was not as easy as it was when I was much younger. And we have our little fur baby, Avery. I started in physical security, transitioned to cyber 4 years ago. And now I kind of do a little bit of both because they both fit really well together. They kind of go hand in hand, just like data privacy. I recently published a book called The Digital Citizen's Guide to Cybersecurity, How to Be Safe and Empowered Online. I will throw a little link in the chat if you'd like to take a look at it, but it is on Amazon Kindle as well as paperback. And the inspiration of writing that book specifically was a presentation that I did just before COVID for 4th and 5th graders, having conversations with them around various different topics of cybersecurity. And when I saw how engaged and excited they were about these topics, it inspired me to help to provide more content for them to be able to be empowered and learn how to be safe online. And kind of the audience for that book is age 12 all the way up to 100. It kind of has a little of something for everyone and is very non-technical, by the way. So if you wouldn't mind just throwing in the chat what your role is at your library, or what your role is in general within the RCLS system, that would be fantastic, just so I have an idea. And while you're doing that, I will go over our agenda. So today we are going to start by discussing and defining what data privacy is. We will talk about privacy versus confidentiality, because there is a difference. We will talk about consent, or informed consent, or explicit consent versus opt-out philosophy. And then we're going to go through the anatomy of a privacy policy. I thought that by going through the various different things that should be included on a privacy policy, it would give people some actionable things that they could take away from this training and bring back. And if you do have a privacy policy, it would give you an opportunity to take a look at the one that you have and make sure that you have these various different components in there. And if you don't have a privacy policy, it would give you a starting point, something to kind of base off our framework. So, all right, so we have adult services, trustee, adult services, and director. Perfect. So I think, Megan, you came in a little late, and Charlotte as well. If you didn't hear me, normally I say, make sure you keep your mics muted. If you have a question, just jump in or throw it into the chat. I do appreciate if you have the ability to turn your camera on. It just gives me some feedback, so I know if I'm losing people, going too fast, too slow. But if you can't, then I understand as well. And we will get started. So first, let's talk about what data privacy is in the context of the library setting, right? So in a library setting, it is user privacy. User privacy is the right to open inquiry without having the subject of one's interests examined or scrutinized by others. This includes library materials that are consulted, borrowed or acquired by the data subject. And we'll get into some of in the next slide, we'll get into some of the terms defined. But the data subject in this case would be the patron or user. And I did get that definition specifically from the American Library Association because I wanted to make sure that it was fully accurate in terms of the context of the library setting. So this goes a little bit beyond the scope of the traditional terms that we use for data privacy, in that normally in a business context, data privacy we would take personally identifiable information and we'd have to make sure that we have controls around that. In this case, we're talking not only about their PII, but also about any inquiry they're making within the library system. So that information it needs to be held protected as well. So I thought that was interesting. as I was doing research for this particular presentation, because it's a little bit different than the context of most business applications. And so, you know, if you want to do your little hand raise or whatever on the emojis in Zoom, but was everybody aware of that information in terms of data privacy in the library setting, that information is also protected private information for patrons? You can either do it in the chat or just raise your hand or something in the little emoji section of Zoom. Because even as a trustee, I wasn't aware that information was protected. So it's something that at our next meeting, I'm going to bring up and as a part of conversation, just to make sure that was awesome. Good. Glad to see that some people are aware. So I wanted to get into a little bit of defining terms around data privacy, just so as I'm talking about these things, everybody is on the same page. So when we're talking around the concept of data privacy, the data subject is the individual person that can be identified directly or indirectly by an identifier. An identifier could be think of any type of uniqueness, right? So in the context of the library, for example, their name could be associated with a code or a number or an ID within the library system, right? So that would be an identifier. Information around their physical attributes, physiological attributes, you know, biometric attributes. Those are kind of anything that can identify that person. So that's the data subject, the person who can be identified. Personally identifiable information are the unique data sets that could identify the specific individual, like social security number, driver's ID. In the case of the library, it would be the ID number associated with their name if you use one. Any kind of, you know, fingerprint information, I said social security number. So anything that ties back that's unique to the individual. And then we have personal information, which is a little bit different than personally identifiable information. And that personal information is information around the individual that describes likes, dislikes, or preferences. So data privacy in the library setting actually extends to some personal information when you think about the inquiries that they're making and the research that they're doing, that information is also protected. In other contexts, it's not protected, right? So likes and dislikes and things that could create kind of a persona about somebody is not necessarily protected in a lot of most other contexts. So I thought that was interesting as well. Then we have the data controller and the data processor. So the data controller is the person or identity or entity rather that determines the purposes for which and the means by which PII is processed. So the controller is the one that is making the decisions on what types of information are being collected and then how we're going to process that information. The data processor is a computer or person, and oftentimes it's a third party, is the computer or person that carries out operations on the data to retrieve it, transform it, or classify it. And this processor will process the information on behalf of the data controller. So an easy example for that is, you know, if you use ADP, for example, for payroll. So you're the data controller, your organization would control the information that would be provided and how it's processed. And then the processors would actually carry out those payroll transactions. Does anybody have any questions about these particular, it's not all of the terms, but they were just some that we're going to be talking about. And I thought that it would just be easy to kind of put it out there. Okay. So here I wanted to talk a little bit about the types of classes of data. So when we talk about cybersecurity, we often will add controls around various different data sets. And if you remember, a control is something that's put in place to protect or defend the network. And so depending on the data set is how much you're going to invest in the controls that are going to be put around that data. It also will predicate if that particular data is protected by regulation or law, right? So PII and PHI in particular, personal health information, those have specific rules about how you have to protect that information, and it's regulated. So if you violate those rules, you can get fined, or there could be criminal charges or whatever. So as we said before, personally identifiable information is very unique to the individual, right? It's going to be able to determine that I, in fact, am Antoinette King. So just think thumbprint or something that nobody else can share. Personal health data is information that surrounds our personal health. So another interesting thing that I uncovered while doing the research for this particular presentation is in the library settings, if you have documented any patron needs or requirements for ADA adaptations or accommodations, that information has to be protected with specific controls. Not only does it have to be protected, but it also, you have to make sure that not everybody has access to that information. So if you are collecting and storing that type of, ADA requirements that you need for particular patrons, you need to make sure you have policies and procedures in place of how that information is going to be protected and where it's being stored. So internal data is information that your organization can share, obviously internally, but that it's not something that you want to get outside. So sometimes internal policies and procedures on how you process or maintain or retain data, some of those things may not want to be exposed to the outside world. So you want to make sure that you discern and classify what is considered internal and then what is not. Confidential data would be information that, if exposed, could cause damage to your organization or to the individual or other organization that that data is about. And then obviously the least controlled is public data. So that would be the information that we would be posting around our organization or posting up to the public website. Does anybody have any questions about the various classes of data?
Yeah, I got two, or they're related, I guess. So is PHI, I mean, not looking for a legal definition because you're not a lawyer, but is PHI directly related to HIPAA or and particularly what you mentioned about like anything ADA compliancy for a particular, would that be PHI or would it fall under PII for us?
No, that's PHI. So any ADA accommodations that you need to, that you've recorded and documented. So if you had knowledge of it and you just had a conversation, you shouldn't disclose it, but it's not information that could be breached, right? But if you document it and you store that information, whether it's written by hand or in a computer system, that is absolutely considered PHI and needs to be protected accordingly.
Thanks.
No problem. And again, it was context within the library, and it's important for me when I do these trainings to make sure I'm applying it to the audience, right? And these types of things were very interesting to me because I had never really considered that a library would have PHI. And then when the example was given about ADA accommodations, I was like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, and think beyond like wheelchair, like if somebody is hearing impaired or sight impaired, and that's documented on their record, be really mindful about that, because if the data record is breached, that now brings you to a whole new level of fines and a whole new level of accountability when it comes to PHI. So think twice before you document and store that information is the point here.
I'm interested. I'm going to follow up at the system level to see, or I mean, Charlotte might know, being a director, or anybody might know, I guess, if whether we actually can store that information in our system or not, in the customer records, because we would be liable to, I guess, HIPAA compliance controls after that if we're storing it. So. something to look at.
I don't know that anybody puts anything like that in the patron record. You might put something in a note, but I wouldn't advise it.
Yeah, it's not, if it's not in there officially, then yeah, we probably, yeah, so we'll have to follow up on that. It's a good point.
Good question, David. So in terms of, so first and foremost, if there was a data breach, it has, and the record had PHI or PII, it has to be disclosed within a certain time frame. And so HIPAA has different rules in terms of the disclosure requirement, but let's just say hypothetically that in Charlotte, as Charlotte mentioned, somebody put in a note on their record. So like in the side where they can manually type anything in, person A requires height of table to be 42 inches because they're in a wheelchair, whatever, right? We write that in there. And that data record was part of a bigger set of records that was breached. That has to be reported through the proper reporting mechanism of HIPAA. And then yes, they will apply sanctions or fines based on the severity, right? So depending on what type of information was breached. Yes, Jen.
I feel that it's important for me to state at this time that there should never, ever be this sort of information placed in a patron record.
Mhm.
There should never be social security number or anything that would cause there to be any sort of issues regarding HIPAA or a data breach when it comes to health identification or anything. So I'm just going to say that. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. And that's really important. I'm going to give a totally off example of where personal information could potentially be recorded inadvertently. So I was in sales for most of my career in the security industry, or the latter part of my career in the security industry. And as a good salesperson, I would do things like in our Salesforce tool that we had under the record for that individual, I would put in the notes a reminder that when their birthday was, for example, I would put a reminder that they have 3 kids and one goes to Fordham University or whatever. And I would put that information. And prior to my training and my education that I got on cybersecurity, I didn't realize that that's personal information that's being maintained and stored without the consent of the individual. So as a good salesperson, I'm trying to document all this stuff because you can't remember everybody's kids' names and what their wives do and all of these things. And so I had to go back through all of after I learned about this stuff, I had to go back through. So sometimes it's being put in there with the best of intentions, right? Because you want to be a nice person and do all these things, and you don't realize that you might be putting the organization at risk. The closest thing that might come up with respect to PHI is homebound patrons. Yeah, that's possible. So we're going to get to that. So if they were to have preferences selected, let's say for a large text or visually impaired, and they need the audio and there's an option to select for that. If you're using a third-party system, which most of the time I would think that would be done through a third-party system, and we'll get into it, their data privacy policy should be linked to yours so that the patron can determine if they want to disclose that information, how that's being stored and managed and processed with that third party. So we're going to get into that, but really great point. And I didn't even think about that. So we'll definitely get there. Okay. So I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about the evolution of data privacy. So initially data privacy, we had, security, then we had privacy, and then they overlap where sensitive information lies, right? And that's great because that's important. And so we were really, really focused on the information and controlling the security around the information. But what we've migrated towards in this new privacy 2.0, for lack of a better word, is that on top of that sensitive information is actually the people's rights. Because before we're collecting and storing sensitive information, we need to make sure that we are providing the data subject with the right to not be included in your data set if they don't want to, and then B, the right to know what you're collecting, why you're collecting it, and how long you're collecting it, and who has access to it. So as we talk about this issue of data privacy, we want to frame it in not just the types of information, but we also want to frame it in the rights of the data subject. And I think that's a really important and really good transition as we move through this evolution of data privacy. Okay. So privacy versus confidentiality. Privacy is the expectation of the data subject. So when they're engaging in your library, they are going to expect that the actions that they are taking, the things that they're doing, the transactions that they're doing are private to them. Confidentiality is the responsibility of the library. When you're in possession of patron or employee, PII or PHI, I should add in there, to keep that information private and protected, right? So things that the library might want to create procedures around are things like protecting the patron contact information, closed stack call slips, computer sign-up sheets, registration for equipment or facilities, circulation records, what websites were visited on the computer by a particular individual, any reserve notices or research notes that they might have that might live on library resources, right? So we want to make sure that any of the information that could be tracked to a particular patron, again, remember that the data privacy expands in a library setting a little bit farther than the typical data privacy controls in regular industry, right? Because all of this stuff can really create kind of a persona around that individual, their likes and dislikes and all those kinds of things. So we need to make sure that all these things are protected. And if we're keeping them, we have to make sure that only people who need access to this information will have access to the information. A couple of months ago, we had a bunch of extra equipment at our library, and we put out a notice saying, hey, if you're interested in, we had computer screens and a couple of other things, and just let us know if you know somebody in need of these things, sign up, right? And so it didn't occur to me back then, and now I'm going to ask at our next meeting as well. I have a list of notes of things. What did we do with that sign up sheet where we like people's names were listed that were in need of these particular equipment? What did we do with that sign up sheet? I know that those particular assets were library, not RCLS, by the way. Bernie, we didn't give away RCLS items. They were library owned assets that we were no longer using, but we need to document that those assets went to a patron, and then where did we keep that information and how are we protecting it, right? That's really, really important information. So if you do things like that, just remember, even handwritten sign-up sheets and things like that need to be protected or shredded. And if you're going to keep them, you need to have a policy around that, which we'll talk about. And if you're going to shred them, you need to have a policy around that where it dictates this is what we will always do, right? We want to make sure that there's consistency, because if somebody makes a complaint about fill in the blank of any of these things, that information got out about them and it was due to negligence for your facility, you need to provide evidence that, nope, this is our policy, this is our procedure, and this is actually what we did with that information and how we protected it. So that's privacy versus confidentiality. The next thing I wanted to talk about was consent versus opt-out. So if you remember, when we had that Venn diagram, the data subjects' rights are now the focus of data privacy. So when we started to have this conversation about data privacy, everybody went with an opt-out policy. Basically, if you were in my database already, you existed in my database, I would send out spam email. I'm just going to use email as an example because it's easy. Send out spam email. And at the very, very bottom, you have the ability to click a link and go to a website and opt out. And I'm going to ask you 36 questions and you're going to get annoyed. And then you end up staying in my database. So that's kind of the opt-out mentality where a user's automatically enrolled into the data collection process and they don't have the specific details of what we're collecting and how we're using them and all those things that I was talking about before. And the user has to actively opt out of their data being collected and then request that their data be removed from the database. So there's a lot of user focused activities that go around opting out. We are now migrating in the privacy field to explicit and informed consent. This means that the users are given the option to agree or disagree with data collection before their data is entered into a database. In this methodology, the user is informed in a very specific and unambiguous manner regarding how their data will be collected, used, and or shared. And then the user is given the choice before choosing to access a service rather than having to opt out later, right? So all of this is a proactive approach to data privacy where the data subject has control as to whether or not they're willing to give that information away. Now, there's a lot of caveats with this, and I've seen it, and it's poor practice, but there are some organizations that say, this is my privacy policy. If you don't like it, no problem. You can't use my service. And then that's it. You can't log into the website. You can't access the service. So I think that that is, it's kind of thumbing your nose at this whole informed consent, because the balance of power goes out of whack when you need access to a service, but they're essentially saying, this is how we're going to use your data and you don't have any choice in the matter. So here you go. And now you're going to use our service, right? So we've got your consent. I have some really interesting research I did on data privacy and informed and explicit consent in K through 12 environments. So there was a school district that was using biometrics to do attendance. And basically when the kids would come in, they'd use hand geometry, they'd stick their hand on the thing and they'd sign them in. They sent a notice to the parents before they were implementing the system that they were going to be using this solution, and they gave the parents the option, you don't have to use it. We will then do the traditional sign them in method with the teacher. So you don't have to do it. We'll just do something different for them. So it got rolled out. They collected all of the consent forms, and some parents agreed and some parents didn't agree. And a group of parents that didn't agree with it actually ended up suing and this happened in the Netherlands, by the way, or I'm sorry, Sweden. A bunch of parents got together and they decided they were going to sue the school because even though they were given a consent form, they felt that there was an imbalance of power between the school district and the parents, because now their children were going to be treated differently in the attendance process. So their children were being isolated out of the normal process. And they actually won, and the school was assessed through GDPR, which is the European Union's collective privacy ruling. They were fined heavily for using that system with biometric data, even though they did get the consent of the parents, because there was that imbalance of power. So when we talk about explicit and informed consent, we also have to consider, could it be perceived in any way, shape, or form if any kind of coercion or imbalance of power exists when we're asking for consent to collect and retain data in exchange for services? Does anybody have any questions about the consent versus the opt-out? Okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit about data collection do's and don'ts. Now, please, disclosure, this is not an exhaustive list of things, but just some real high level, what we should and shouldn't do, and not super prescriptive, but just kind of like the obvious ones, right? We want to work with vendors that store or process sensitive data to ensure the protection of the information. So going back to what you were mentioning, David, earlier, a lot of libraries use third-party systems to provide services to patrons. And if in that third-party system, someone selects the option for visually impaired, and then it automatically gives them, let's say, audiobooks or large print books. Well, if that information is attached to an identifier that can identify that individual, that's PHI, and that needs to be protected. So if you have systems that do that, or if your systems do that, you need to make sure that the information that you're collecting is stored and maintained properly, and that only the people that need to have access to it can have access to it. Get informed consent, like we talked about prior to collection of data. Only collect what you need to do the task and only store the data for as long as you need it. Now, the storing of the data for as long as you need it is often a topic, a little bit of taboo topic, because many organizations don't purge their data and they just keep collecting and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So if you don't have a data retention policy in existence, it might be something that you want to start having conversations around. How long are we going to retain data? And, at what point do we decide we're going to purge it? So, and then of course, we don't want to collect data just in case we might need it. We're only going to collect the things that we need to do what we need to do. We want to make sure we're not storing sensitive data indefinitely, and we do not want to use that automatic opt-in for patrons so that we're collecting their data automatically, right? We want to give informed consent, so give them the option. When a patron enrolls or a new patron enrolls and gets a library card, that might be something that you do then. Give them the opportunity to sign or agree that they want to receive emails or correspondence and be in that database, or they can check a box that says, no, they don't want to receive emails. 9 times out of 10, they're going to want to receive that information. That's where they're joining the library, but give them the opportunities to say yes or no. So the vendor thing is really important, right? And that's something that often gets missed in many, many organizations. They're like, we're protecting our data, we're doing all this great stuff. But if you look at the data breaches that have been happening historically in the last 12 to 24 months, they're all supply chain data breaches. They're all breaches that are happening from third parties. So we want to make sure that we are asking our vendors that information. Any questions on kind of the do's and don'ts? All right, so now I'm going to get a little bit into what I call the meat and potatoes of the anatomy of a privacy policy. Again, these are suggestions. I'm not saying this is, perfect for every organization, but there are topics that I definitely think should be included, and there may be more things that you want to include on top of that. But at least if you're hitting each one of these, we can make sure that it's comprehensive enough that your patrons and your employees will understand what your philosophy is around data privacy. So the first thing we want to create is a privacy statement. This statement is going to identify your library's commitment to privacy, values, and ethics. So you're going to make a statement about why privacy is important to your library, and that's going to be kind of the opener for your privacy policy. And it should be at least 2 paragraphs, or or at least one real good meaty paragraph about why privacy matters to the library and detailing out that commitment. The next thing you want to make sure that you do is disclose what kind of information you're collecting. So if you need to collect PII, disclose that, but also non-PII is that you're collecting about patrons. So, and then in this section is where you want to be sure to include information collected or processed by third-party vendors. So if they're going to use something on the website, for example, to have ebooks, and your ebooks are done through a third party, you want to make sure that you are clear about what that vendor collects and stores and how they're using the data. And then you want to give them a link to those third-party privacy policies so that they can go and do their due diligence on their own. In this section, you don't have to rewrite the vendor's policies, but if you just have the links to the various different vendors that you're working with and where their policies are, then the websites, I think that's perfectly adequate. You want to include a statement about your data retention policy. So this is the policy that's going to dictate how long you retain patron data, including borrowing history. If you don't have a retention policy, you want to think about creating one because there should be a life cycle to data. And you collect the data, you use the data, and once it gets past a certain time frame, you purge the data. And there are processes around destruction of data, right? So that's included in the data retention policy, which we're not going to get into the details of that now, but it is something that's important. So, browsing history, whatever your policy is on that, are you going to keep it 1 year, 2 years, 3 years? At that 2-3 year mark, you want to make sure that it's being purged out of your system. And you want to be consistent, because if anybody questions these processes, you want to be able to go back to the policy and say, nope, this is what we're doing. This is how long we retain it for. And we discarded it. And this is the process that we use to discard the information. Next, we want to identify who within your organization or externally to your organization has access to the patron's data or the employee's data. And you can have a privacy policy that includes both employees or patrons, or you can have two separate privacy policies, one specific to employees and the other specific to patrons. But I think it's important to have both somewhere covered. And the employees could be put in their employee handbook as well, as part of their handbook. So we want to include a statement about how you keep their information confidential, but also identify who may have access to their data and then why they have access to it. And it doesn't have to be individual names. I actually don't recommending putting individual people's names. It would be the role of that person and why that role needs to have access to their data. A statement of how you protect the privacy of students and minors. So if your library is associated with schools, you're going to have a lot of students coming in. I know, in Mamacating, we have students that use their, like if they have volunteer hours in a particular school district, they will go to the library and they'll say, hey, do you have anything for me to do so I can sign off for my community service hours? And so if we're keeping that information about those students and the work that they conducted, we need to make sure that we're protecting it. And when we write this section of that policy, you need to reference the laws and statutes that you're basing that on. So, oh, I forgot my end parentheses. Sorry about that. Sorry. Just skipped ahead by accident. So FERPA would be a good example of something to reference when you're keeping student information. The other thing that you might be doing, some schools do, this is usually in higher education more than K through 12 environment, but if students are doing research and you have a research section of your library that's part of any kind of research initiatives, and that information is being stored on library resources, you need to make sure that that is all protected. You need to also include a section in the policy to cover website and computers. So on your website, if you're hosting your website, are you employing HTTPS, which is a secure link between the computer user or the person or that's requesting website access and your website, right? So are you employing HTTPS? You want to describe what your cookie usage is. So in that area, you want to talk about what a cookie is. So if you remember from past trainings, cookies are information or data that is stored in a web browser about a particular user's browsing history. So if you are using cookies, then you want to explain what cookies you're using and the types of cookies that you're using and why you're using them on your website. For all public computers and connected devices, you want to inform them of the protections in place for those devices, as well as your public Wi-Fi. So what are the controls that are being put in place for your public Wi-Fi? You know, do you have, is it password protected, for example, or can any person walking past the library just jump onto your Wi-Fi without any kind of password access? So that section, you want to get into a little bit of the technical details, which if you need support doing that, I'm sure someone at RCLS could help if you don't have the technical resources within your facility. You want to include that third-party vendor statement. So here you're going to give a summary of the types of information that may be collected, used, and shared by third-party vendors, and then include what your expectations of those third parties are when it comes to privacy, right? So you're going to kind of map out what you tell your vendors when it comes to privacy, what your expectations are, and that should mirror your privacy statement in the beginning, right? So it should mirror what your statement was when you started the policy. Video surveillance statement. So this is really important as well. Are you using video surveillance in your facility? If you are, you should be transparent about what types of systems that you're using, what your video retention policy is. Are you using facial recognition or any kind of video analytics within that system, and who has access to that system? So the video surveillance is a sensitive topic in a lot of states, especially like New York and California when it comes to the use of biometrics and facial recognition. So if you are using any of those tools for any reason, you need to make sure it's disclosed, and you need to have a clear reason as to why you're using them. And then obviously we don't want to have just anybody be able to get into your system. So we want to, especially when we have a lot of children that are in the facility. So we want to make sure that we clearly discern what, again, not the names of the people, but what roles within your organization actually have access to get into viewing the system live and recorded. Sometimes people are allowed to view live, but they can't access recorded video. And then sometimes people are allowed to do both, right? And also consider that if there are people internal and external to your organization that have access to the video surveillance systems, in some cases, I know in K through 12, they'll maybe share cameras with law enforcement. So if you're sharing any, maybe there are outdoor cameras, if you're sharing any cameras, video feeds with law enforcement or any other third party, you want to make sure that you disclose that within that video surveillance statement. And then you also want to have a statement about law enforcement cooperation. So here you're going to detail procedures that if law enforcement requests access to a user's record, what steps you take to document the request and then to comply or not comply, right? So this, I highly suggest that you consult with a legal counsel, but I think it's really important for you to have a statement in there so that people are aware. Again, we're talking informed consent, that people are aware that if they get a request from law enforcement, this is what the steps that you take in order to make sure that you keep their information confidential unless it's absolutely necessary to disclose. Does anybody have any questions about those 8 items that I mentioned? I can go back if you need me to on kind of the anatomy of a privacy policy and what that looks like.
I was watching something recently and there was discussion, it was a webinar and there was discussion about cooperating with law enforcement and even that there could be a differentiation between outside view cameras versus inside view cameras, because outside view is just in the public, the parking lot, and it might be different content, somebody pulling up, parking, leaving, versus somebody actually walking in the building. You can identify the person there. You have other cameras inside. You can see where they walked to and where they were in the stacks. So even having a differentiation with those two might be useful.
Yeah, absolutely. And so when we're walking down the sidewalk, there is zero expectation of privacy, right? We're walking down the sidewalk. But if somebody parks their vehicle in the parking lot and there's a parking lot camera, and then you can see their license plate on their car and they get out of that car and then they walk in and they also look in a particular stack and you know that this particular topic is down that aisle. Now, all of a sudden, there's a lot of data about that individual person that identifies them. You're absolutely correct. So, recognizing that you have access. Maybe a lot of people don't think about the video surveillance systems and the information that they can collect, but if you have cameras in your parking lot and they can see license plates of vehicles, that is also sensitive information and it's unique to the vehicle that individual came in. So you just need to be cognizant of the fact that information resides on your system and that you need to protect it.
Yeah, and then the other point that they made too was just in general, it can be difficult because it can be a political situation because you're dealing with the local town cops and things like that. And it's completely within your rights and within the law to say, yeah, I can give you that information. Go get a search warrant.
100%. As a matter of fact, I typically would recommend, and my family's in law enforcement, I would recommend putting the onus back on law enforcement, unless it's a life and death situation where they need to access it because there's threat of life, right? If they're asking for something after the fact and there's no emergency, I would put the onus on law enforcement to give you that documentation to protect the library from a liability perspective, 100%, because then you can then put, as per your privacy policy, this is the steps that we take. We request that they give us formal requests in writing. It needs to have, a warrant or subpoena or something like that attached to it. They can't just come in and say, oh, can I have Bob Smith's, records from whatever books that he was looking at, or can we look at the video surveillance from Tuesday at 4:00? They can't just do that. They don't have the right to do that.
And even to kind of quell their concerns and say, we'll make a copy of it right now, but you still need to bring in a search warrant
Absolutely.
to get the copy for your own review, for legal review. So.
Absolutely. Great point. So here are just some key takeaways: that privacy is an important issue to be considered when collecting and processing patron and employee information. Understanding the classes of data that you're collecting is important to determine how you're going to protect them. We're not going to put $1 million worth of security protections around data that's publicly available, right? So we only want to make sure that we're spending and investing in protecting the data that's sensitive and private. We only want to collect the data that's required to perform the tasks and only retain that data for as long as you need it. Of course, I said it a million times: consent, consent, consent. We want to make sure we're getting permission to collect data, and then it's informed consent, so they know exactly how, why, and for how long you're collecting their data. And make sure that your privacy policy is clear. You do not want a 22-page privacy policy. You want it to be clear. You want it to be in plain language. It does not need to be in legalese, and you wanted to make it readily available for the public, perhaps on a link on your website, or, you know, if someone requests it, then you can provide them with a copy of it. So that's all I have for today. Does anybody have any other questions? I really appreciate the engagement because, again, this was something, it was a different context that I normally speak about privacy, and I learned a lot actually preparing for this presentation. So it was a great opportunity for me too. I always love learning new things. All right, Jen?
Thank you. I thought that was absolutely fantastic.
Thank you.
I do appreciate it. I'm going to stop the recording and we will